Good morning. Today we are speaking about the modern children's literature in the Dutch language and a little bit about the history of this literature. This interview takes place as part of the Festival of Modern Dutch Language Literature and as part of the Moscow International Book Fair. My name is Irina Mikhailova. I am a teacher of Dutch language and literature at the University of St. Petersburg, and I translate books from Dutch into Russian. We wanted to speak with several Dutch specialists in the children's literature, and one of the best specialists is Vanessa Joosens, who is taking part at our interview today. She is Associate Professor of Literature, of Children's Literature, of the University of Antwerp. And she is here, and now we will start our conversation. But before we start talking about the children's literature in the Dutch language, I want to make important clarification for Russian audience. Mm-hmm. When we talk about Dutch literature or Dutch language literature, we mean the literature in Dutch language, which is spoken in the North Netherlands, in the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and in Flanders. And Flanders, for some Russian people, it is important to say it, Flanders is the northern half of Belgium. Mm-hmm. Children's literature from the Netherlands and Flanders is not really new to Russian readers. Dutch and Flemish authors have been translated into Russian for many years. For example, Annie M.G. Schmidt's books have already entered the list of books that parents recommend to each other for family reading. Jip and Janneke, in Russian it is Sasha and Masha, they have Russian names in Russian. This series of books can be found in hundreds of thousands of families. And also many Russian young readers love Pluk van de Pettenflat and Otje. Otje, her name in Russian is Oshinka. And the second author who is very much loved in Russia is Toon Tellegen. His animal stories are read and admired by thousands and thousands children and grown-ups in Russia. And his animal stories have become basis for theater performances in different cities of Russia. Do you like Toon Tellegen?
Yes, of course. Yeah, very much. I think his stories are really ageless.
Ageless,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
You can read his stories at different levels,
Mm-hmm.
as a child and as a grown-up. As for other Dutch and Flemish authors, they are not so famous as, not yet so famous as Annie M.G. Schmidt and Toon Tellegen. But many of their books are also translated and published in Russia. I mean such books as Fox and Hare by Flemish authors Sylvia van den Heide, with pictures by Tae Jong King. These books are for readers from 4 to 7. Then very much admired in Russia is Matthias de Leeuw, a young painter who makes books without words. And the illustrations of Floor Rieder, who illustrated Alice in Wonderland and many other books. Do you know these illustrations? Yes?
Yes, yeah. She's a rising star here as well.
Yes, and also books for bigger children by Guus Kuijer and Peter van Gestel. Mm-hmm. The Dutch and Flemish children's literature is very original and has the highest standards. And this is a unique combination of illustrations and texts. Dutch and Flemish authors do it more often than in other countries. And this high level of this kind of literature is the merit of the governments of the two countries and the activities of the Dutch and Flemish foundations for promoting literature. Nederlands Letterenfonds and Vlaams Fonds voor de Letteren. These foundations support talented writers who write in Dutch and who illustrate Dutch books. These foundations have a good system of translation grants, what is important for me as translator and for many other translators, of course, and organize professional trips for publishers from the whole world to the Netherlands and Flanders to let foreign publishers meet their colleagues and other people who are involved in the production of Dutch and Flemish children's books. So this was the introduction, and then the last alinea of the introduction. To help Russian readers better understand the variety and the high quality of the Dutch language children's literature written by Dutch and Flemish authors, a number of Russian publishing houses who publish children's books hold in 2020 a festival of modern Dutch language literature. This festival is organized on the initiative of the Samokat publishing house and is supported by the Literature Foundation of both countries. This festival starts together with the Moscow International Book Fair on the 3rd of September and runs until the end of 2020. So this is the end of the introduction.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's very interesting to hear, Irina. Yeah, very interesting to hear how many authors have been translated and are actually well known. My
first question is children's literature in the North Netherlands and in the South Netherlands, the Flanders. Do you consider it as one literature or two literatures? Do they differ in themes, style, and values? And the next part of this question is, who played a key role in the development of Dutch and Flemish literature in general and literature for children in particular?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this question. So if we look at Flanders and the Netherlands, the northern part of the Low Countries, I would say in some ways they are one system and in other ways they are separated. I grew up with a lot of books from the Netherlands, even though I grew up in Flanders. And for a long time, Flemish literature or the Flemish literary system was very much dominated by books from the Netherlands. So in the post-war period, up until I would say the 1970s, a lot of books from the Netherlands were read in Belgium, not so much the other way around. Since then, we see that there is more traffic crossing the border in both ways, in both directions. Plus, also, there is a lot of collaboration between Dutch and Flemish producers of children's books. So you will sometimes see that Flemish authors will publish with Dutch publishing houses and sometimes vice versa. You will also see that when we make picture books, that it's very often a collaboration between Dutch and Flemish makers of children's books. So for example, the Dutch author, Edward van de Vendel, he writes many books, many texts for picture books. And it's quite common that those picture books will be illustrated by a Flemish illustrator. So those kinds of collaborations exist in numerous ways and forms. At the same time, we do see distinct trends, I would say, in Flanders and the Netherlands. For example, in both countries, we pay a lot of attention to illustrations. And you've mentioned this in the introduction. We have a rich culture in illustrations, and that's true for both countries. But for example, in Flanders, the illustrations tend to be a bit more experimental. And we also have a market of picture books for adults, where illustrators will sometimes illustrate for children, but some of their books are more geared in themes and styles towards an older audience. Whereas the Dutch, I would say, have a very strong tradition in good domestic stories for children, often very humorous. And this, of course, is a tradition that's, I wouldn't say has been established, but yeah, has really been, how to express this? Annie M. G. Schmidt was not the first to write in this trend and style. She had her predecessors too, but of course Annie M. G. Schmidt made those kinds of domestic stories really famous. And so she sparked a whole trend of these kinds of domestic stories of children being situated around the house, often with a lot of humor. And this is a trend that we still see with authors like Hans Hage, for example, in the Netherlands, with some of Edward van de Vendel's stories as well. We have that in Flanders to some extent, but I would say this is one of the things that does distinguish the Dutch tradition from the Flemish.
And also you have Joke van Leeuwen, who is...
Yes.
Well, though she is born in the Netherlands.
I was just going to say, the question is, what is she? Is she Dutch or is she Flemish? So indeed, she was born in the Netherlands, but spent part of her youth and all of her adulthood, I think, in Flanders. And so she's indeed also one of these bridging figures, who is truly rooted in both systems.
Yes, yes. And also she writes texts and makes illustrations. So this is also very...
Yeah, indeed. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. The second question was very long formulated.
Mm-hmm.
We know various national literatures. Different countries at different times have developed different ideas about the task and roles of children's literature. Nowadays, we know the modern Dutch language literature as one of the freest and boldest in the world. But when we started to investigate the history of the issue, we discovered that Dutch literature is not at all a phenomenon of recent decades, but it is a historically formed phenomenon. In the 16th century, the great humanist Erasmus paid much attention to children's education. And in the 17th century, there was a discussion about the specifics of children's literature. Dutch authors of that time spoke about respect for the child and recognized games and playing as the main way of children's learning and exploration of the world. We discovered the doctor and writer Jan van Beverwijk, who lived in the 17th century. He wrote about education, and he had a lot of ideas about children's freedom. This attitude towards the children in the Netherlands in the 17th century surprised foreigners who visited the country at that time. The question is, if you know these names, Erasmus, I think you know, of course, but Jan van Beverwijk, and do you think that these authors really influenced the development of the national literature for children?
So Jan van Beverwijk is not that well known anymore. Of course, I'm not a pedagogue, so it may be possible that he studied in, theories of pedagogy. I come from children's literature more from literary studies. And even though I've contributed to writing a history of Dutch and Flemish children's literature, he was not a very central figure in that history. However, those ideas of allowing children freedom to explore, those ideas do sound familiar if you have studied Dutch children's literature, of course, though I would be hesitant to say that the trends that we see in the present were always there in the past too, because if you look at the person who is considered to be the founding father of Dutch children's literature is a Dutch 17th century author, Hieronymus van Alphen. And if you read his texts today, they're very much written in that Enlightenment spirit of the child as the blank slate, and the adult who really needs to instruct the child. And the child, it's a text that's very much written in the spirit of John Locke, who said we have to combine pleasure and playing with learning. And so there's a famous poem by Hieronymus van Alphen that's called Mijn spelen is leren, which means my playing is learning, so I'm learning through play. But there's more learning than play in those texts. And so in the 17th century and also in part of the 18th century, that was still very much the spirit of Dutch children's literature. Let's not forget, for example, that the fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm were not popular in the Low Countries for many decades after they came out. So after the Grimm fairy tales were already very successful in Germany, in the United Kingdom, and of course Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales were very popular in Denmark and Scandinavian countries. Dutch literature was quite hesitant to accept these kinds of fantasy stories. Yeah, so their stories were much more rooted also in reality, in learning, in this educational system. And it's not until the second half of the 19th century that we see a more playful, more romantic spirit of childhood being established, in which the child's freedom was also more celebrated than in those earlier periods.
Thank you. I have read somewhere that during the Enlightenment, some Dutch writers from the Enlightenment, they said that the fairy tales by Grimm can be published for children, but there must be a preface, and in this preface, the parents must read and explain to their children that the magic exists only in fairy tales.
Yeah.
I don't think that the magic can be in the reality too. And so we'll go to the third question, if you don't mind. Yes. Mm-hmm. This is the question. Many researchers of children's literature agree that the rapid development of children's books began in the post-war period, after the Second World War, when the people began to appreciate peace, family, personality, and childhood. In different countries, the standard of children's literature was changed, so that the author was no longer above the little reader, but near him. Usually, when talking about such a revolution, one mentions Astrid Lindgren, Tove Jansson, and Roald Dahl. We have read that the Dutch and Flemish culture, including children's books, was also booming after the Second World War. How did it happen? Which authors were the key figures in this turning to the childhood?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in this period, I think we do have to distinguish between the Netherlands and Flanders. Because we do see that in the Netherlands there is indeed a new spirit, and of course Annie M. G. Schmidt is key to this trend of bringing a new type of story, also a new kind of poetry to Dutch children's literature. because it was, of course, she wrote in various genres. She wrote short stories like Jip and Janneke, Tasha and Masha. She wrote books like Big Fun of Blitz, but her poetry, I would say, in those early years was the most innovative. And so we see various Dutch poets and authors treading in those footsteps. Whereas Dutch children's literature in Belgium, so Flemish children's literature, at that time was very much still written in a Catholic spirit. So you would have a lot of missionary stories, adventure stories, but not quite as innovative as what was going on in the Netherlands. And then in the 1970s, you see that a number of publishing houses and newspapers also play a big part in producing a new spirit of children's literature. And at that moment, Flemish children's literature, especially the publishing house Lano, also started producing more innovative, progressive children's literature.
To the next question, what trends can you identify in the post-war children's literature? For example, Astrid Lindgren developed the image of a rebel child, Pippi. Tove Jansson created a cozy world where everyone respects and supports each other. In the USSR, Soviet authors wrote about young pioneers and pioneer heroes, and about nature and animals, and it was rather an ideologized sphere. How can you describe the Dutch and Flemish literature and its hero in the last half century, in the second half of the 20th century?
Yeah, so it's a very diverse period, I would say, because I think the big trend that happened, and it's mostly situated in the 1970s and the 1980s, is the so-called emancipation of children's literature, the moment when it really started to be taken seriously, and that at that point you really see a boom in the number of children's books, the kinds of children's books that are being produced, and so forth. So in the period before that, before the 1970s, we see that indeed you have those more rebellious voices like Annie M. G. Schmidt, and you also see more realistic novels being developed for adolescent readers. But it's still, for the most part, in that period, quite traditional literature as well. So girls and boys books were still very popular, adventure stories, romantic fiction for girls, especially in Flanders, but also to some extent in the Netherlands. The religious impact on children's literature was still quite strong. So as I said, also quite a lot of tales about missionaries, books written in the spirit of children growing up to be good citizens in society, contributing to it as good religious people. And so that didactic potential was exploited, but then criticized in the 1970s. And so the 1970s are a very interesting period for various reasons. In the Netherlands, you had a lot of so-called werkgroepen. So these were groups of educators, writers, people really looking at children's books critically. It's also the period when various publications about children's literature start to appear, when children's literature really becomes studied at the university, first in the Netherlands, then later in Flanders. And we see a shift at that moment towards more problem-oriented realist literature. At the same time, you get an awareness that this type of literature is again quite didactic, and so that authors are also investing more and experimenting more with more literary techniques. And then the result of that is in the 1980s and 1990s, we see a lot of voices who come to the fore with often very good literary books, and often also a social critique to the books. And then indeed you get authors like Huskeijer in the Netherlands, who made his debut in the late 1970s. In Belgium, Bart Moejaert comes to the fore in the early 1980s. And then also an author like Anne Provoost. In the Netherlands, in the 1980s, you get a whole trend of authors who also write highly literary books, and that also produces debate. Because in the 1980s and 1990s, we already see the reaction of the critics who then say, are these still children's books? Because then you really see highly literary children's books. So I think somebody like Huskeijer, for example, is so successful because his books are literary, but at the same time also very accessible, playful, humorous. The same goes for Joko van Leeuwen. Whereas other authors have been criticized for writing books that are not so accessible to many child readers.
Thank you. I'm very glad to hear the names that you say, because all these authors are already translated. Some books of them are already translated.
Okay.
And
very good.
Samokat from Huskeijer, it's the book of all the things.
Mm-hmm.
Van alle dingen. And Bart Moejaert, it's brothers.
Yeah.
And Joko van Leeuwen, Iep.
Yeah. Very good.
Yes.
And have you translated them, Irina?
I have translated Bart Moejaert and Joko van Leeuwen, and Huskeijer is translated by my colleague.
Okay, very good.
We have quite a group of people who translate Dutch books, and we like most of all children's books. Really.
Wonderful.
Thank you. The second question was about the 60s and the 70s. You have answered this question to some extent. That the authors in the Netherlands and Flanders wrote books to explain to children some social phenomena and social norms. Mm-hmm. Yes, but the second part of the for Russian readers, some issues which are discussed by Dutch children's authors are still very strange. Such problems as feminism, politics, death, divorce, sexuality. They're very unusual in Russian books and often cause rejection.
Okay.
So the parents don't want to read these books to their children. If they say to their children, there's sex in this book, you must not read it. And how did this kind of themes come into the children's literature in the Netherlands and in Belgium? And some more question. Yes, how we call it shocking realism. What Huskeijer wrote is some kind of shocking realism. How did this kind of shocking realism changed into the literature as space of play and creativity? And here the opposites can be Huskeijer and Toon Terghen. Huskeijer with social and problems, and Toon Terghen with absolutely another kind of problems. But his stories seem to be so idyllic.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll start with the first part. How did it happen, this trend? So I think in the 1970s, we see a pedagogical spirit that is called the New Enlightenment. And the New Enlightenment means that it's written in a philosophy where the idea is children and adults are part of the same world. And it means that many of the problems that adults are confronted with also have an impact on children in one way or another. Sometimes already when they're young, sometimes they will become aware of it when they are older. And so the pedagogical idea is very much that we want to give knowledge to children to make them stronger. We want to teach them critical awareness so that they are able to, to question what they see, what they are told, and that they become conscious, good citizens, who have a keen awareness of what goes on in the world. It's called a New Enlightenment because the difference with the Old Enlightenment, so to say, is that we know that adults too are fallible. And so we know that adults sometimes function as role models, but sometimes are also corrupt and do not always provide good role models. So it's also this movement that is still so influential on Dutch children's literature today, puts a lot of trust in the critical capacities of the child, also to question adults. And so indeed, of course, Flanders and the Netherlands are progressive countries. The Netherlands was one of the first countries in the world to accept and implement gay marriage. And Belgium followed soon after. We have very strong feminist convictions in the Dutch and Flemish societies. So there are a lot of efforts to create equal pay, equal rights. More recently, there's a growing post-colonial awareness as well, and so issues of cultural diversity, but also problems like racism are being addressed in the books. And so the idea is really to give children knowledge and the skills for critical thinking that will make them stronger citizens. And in that sense, I think it's interesting that you place Guus Kuijer and Toon Tellegen in an opposition, because for me they are actually quite similar as well, in the sense that they are both, I know they are very different in some aspects. Kuijer is very often rooted in, his stories are rooted in reality. Tellegen's are a more detached, almost fairy tale-like world. But both are also very much invested in making children think. Kuijer has his child readers think about social problems and social issues and conflicts between members of different generations, for example, the way that children can respond to that. But I think Tellegen is also very much invested in making readers think. In his case, those issues are perhaps not always immediately related to a social problem or social reality. These are more philosophical questions. But I think both have in common that they take the child seriously, that they put a lot of trust in the child's competence for critical reflection, and also that they don't shy away from taboos or do not want to create a kind of innocent world where everything is happy.
But I think that the world of Toon Tellegen is more innocent than the world of Guus Kuijer.
Yeah. Yeah, yes, but at the same time, he sometimes addresses themes like depression, for example.
Depression, yes.
There are stories. He's less explicit, I would say, but I think that's also something that they have in common. Sometimes they address quite serious themes, but in a very playful manner. And Kaya uses a lot of humor to do so. Telehin uses humor and fantasy, but I read some of his stories very much as stories also about loneliness, depression, death sometimes, but at the same time also how to overcome those feelings of sadness, how to deal with them, because many of his stories also deal with friendship and support, and so it puts things in a balance.
Thank you. The next question is, which authors have mostly influenced modern children's literature in Dutch? We mean authors in the Netherlands and Flanders, and also authors abroad. Which foreign children's writers are most popular in the Netherlands?
Okay. So if I start with the second part of the question, so we both in Flanders and the Netherlands, we translate a lot of children's books, mostly from Anglophone countries, also Germany and some Scandinavian countries. If I think of those who have been most influential, I would say Aidan Chambers is a highly influential author, especially for young adult novels, and the authors that he's influenced include Bart Moejaert, of course, in Belgium. He was a role model for Bart Moejaert, also the way that Aidan Chambers wrote about social themes like in homosexuality or identity crisis, religious crisis. He had a very big influence on Flemish and Dutch literature, and he was also more popular in the Dutch-speaking countries before he became popular in the United Kingdom. And so he's influenced Bart Moejaert, but also somebody like Ted van Lieshout. And I would say Ted van Lieshout is also a highly influential author. He is again one of these people who has a very diverse oeuvre with poetry, but also verse novels. He has also done very interesting things with nonfiction. And I think that is also a very strong trend that we see in Dutch literature and Flemish literature today, especially in Dutch literature, I would say, to have artistic nonfiction for children. So Ted van Lieshout has made great books for children about art. We also see many authors like Bibi du Montac writing about animals and animals nonfiction, but very imaginative, very playful books that are nonfiction for children. Of course, there are so many authors who are influential. It's hard to choose. You mentioned Peter van Gestel before. I think he was also one of those authors who was crucial in that emancipation of the children's book. With his highly literary, highly stylized stories, both for younger and for older children. My favorite children's book in Dutch was written by him. It's a book called Winterijs.
Yeah, book Russian.
Did you?
Yes,
oh, wow. Yeah. So that is really my favorite children's book in Dutch in the Dutch language. It's a beautiful story about the aftermath of the Second World War and the Holocaust, but written in such a sensitive, beautiful language, and so but it's one of those books, and he is one of those authors who has been criticized for being elitist. For writing children's books that very few children actually enjoy. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but well, there you go.
Yes, I'm sorry that I say that I have just translated it. It is the merit of a publishing house, Samokат.
Okay.
They choose very good books, and then they ask the translators to translate them. Thank you very much. It was very interesting, a very interesting list of authors.
Yeah, and if you think of other foreign authors, of course, Roald Dahl and Astrid Lindgren were very popular here, and still are. I mean, both of them still are as well.
Yes, of course, yes. Nowadays, Dutch and Flemish illustrators are the most bright, unusual, and peculiar illustrators of the word book market. They use incredible techniques and genres such as illustrated non-fiction, books without text, art books for adults. What has influenced the development of illustration and drawing culture in your countries? Which artists are worth paying attention to?
Yeah, thank you. So that's a beautiful question, because indeed I think illustration is something that Dutch and Flemish artists really excel at. If you ask what has influenced it, I think that both our countries have quite a strong artistic tradition that goes back a long time in history. Whether you think of, the Flemish primitives in Belgium, or the Cobra movement, in which various Dutch artists participated. Of course, we have surrealism in Belgium. So the illustrators that we have often draw inspiration from that, whether it is to develop their style, or sometimes that has been quite a trend here as well. Sometimes they will make picture books based on famous paintings, or made in the style of famous painters and other visual artists. And so that's a source of inspiration for them. We also see that there's a lot of playfulness in the way that the illustrators use this material for children. At the same time, as I said, there's also a trend that they are using it as inspiration for books that seem to be geared more towards adult readers. So I think we have an interesting group of people who do both, who are good at both, like Joke van Leeuwen, and also Ted van Lieshout. So these are people, and Bart Moejaert does it from time to time as well, that these are people who can make the artwork as well as the text. And so you see a very unique blend of pictures and illustrations working together with the text, where they are really interwoven. And in the case of Joke van Leeuwen especially, you often find pictures in the text in a very organic way. I think what helps to keep this dynamics going is that we have various very good art schools. And that we have publishers who sometimes have very close connections with these art schools. And so, for example, the Eenhoorn is a Flemish publisher like that. I know that Marita Vermeulen, who works there, will often go to speak at art schools will often see, at the end of their studies, the illustrators in those art schools have to make like portfolios, or they have to create books, as part of their graduation. And the publishers are in close contacts with those teachers and those students, so that they can really show that illustrating children's books can be rewarding for an artist, and that they can also spot new talent and give it chances. And so we see, I think that's one big factor. I think another factor is that some illustrators have gained a lot of public attention, like Karel Knut, for example. You may know Karel Knut. He's a Flemish illustrator. I think he's our most famous illustrator right now in Belgium, together with artists like Gerda den Dove and Klaas Verplanken. And those are people like Karel Knut had a big exhibition in Ghent a few years ago that drew a lot of press, a lot of attention. The other illustrators often also work for newspapers, so they are really well known beyond just the children's book scene, and manage to inspire authors and readers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It was very interesting what you told me and the listeners, and I hope we will use the information which we get from you for our work in the future. When you're speaking about it, I want to translate everything what you are speaking about.
Thank you so much, Irina.
Thank you, Vanessa. So, bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.